Hi, everyone. This is Nikki from the design team, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. We're going to be looking at ways to use your embossing powder with embossing folders, and we're going to go over two different cards. We're going to get some fun Halloween inspiration, and I'm going to show you two ways that I bet you hadn't thought about for using your embossing powder with embossing folders. Both of these cards will have some ink blending, and when you're ink blending a panel before you're sending it through the embossing folder, it can be a little tricky. So we'll talk about some tips and tricks on that. I also just wanted to show you a couple of quick things on ways to make this ink blending really stand out when you're using an embossing folder, but I'm not going to take you through all the details. I'll make sure to let you know what the colors are in the description. But what I'm doing is I am looking at this embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp. It has a web on it. So we're looking at a spider web, and we're going to do two different cards with spider webs. The center of this web is up in that top corner. So to really make your card kind of pop is to make sure that you have that central focus of your ink blending. So I'm starting with my lightest color right where that web has its center. So we started with Twisted Citron, then we moved to Peacock Feathers, and now we're doing Chipped Sapphire, and I'm going to fill in the rest. And like I said, the reason that my central focus is up there in the top left corner is because that's where it is on the embossing folder. So I'm trying to kind of mimic the pattern that's going to happen on this embossing folder, which you'll be able to see better once we put it through there. But in the meantime, I'm going to finish this ink blending, and then we're going to send it through. Now, to make that spotlight even more bright, I added a little bit of black soot around the edges. That's one of my favorite tricks to really make something stand out when you're doing this dark ink blending, is to add that little bit of black around the edges. Now, let me show you how I line this up. I'm putting it through where I've got it. You see how my central part is where that web comes together? It's a little easier to see now that I've got something in there. Just making sure that everything's lined up the way that I want it to be. And I sprayed this panel with just a little spritz of water on the front, and I let that dry so you can see that there is a little bit of like splatter on it. Now, the key to do this heat embossing is to make sure that you powder this like crazy. Now, before you powder, it's always good to have it be dry, so make sure that your ink is pretty dry. Let it sit for 15-20 minutes at least, and then add the powder to the panel. Now you will notice that these impressions, when I lined up my embossing folder, I add the impressions push into the paper. So these aren't sticking up, they're pushing in. And there's a reason I did that, because I wanted to show you a way that I really like doing embossing folders. And having those ridges really helps you follow the line. So let me show you what we're going to do. I'm using a Wow embossing pen. So this is just embossing ink, and I'm following these lines and tracing them with my pen. This is not very hard to do, almost like having a stencil, because they're indented into the paper. So it's very easy to follow. You just kind of follow that indentation. Yes, it does take some time, but you're going to see the other way that we do this also takes some time. When you're adding this embossing onto an embossing folder, if you don't want it to be messy, you're going to have to take your time with it. Now, I do sections at a time with the powder. I'm using the polished silver, and I don't necessarily dry that. I just want to get some of the ink down and some of it covered up, because I don't want it to dry. It does stay wet a pretty good amount of time, but I was being cautious and making sure that I got the powder sticking on there before that ink dried. So I'm just following all these lines, and I'm going to continue doing that for this entire one. And this folder makes that pretty easy. There still are quite a few lines, but like I said, they're impressed into this, so I can easily follow them, and you can see I can do that at a pretty quick speed. In each little section, I'm adding my powder, and you'll notice I'm not doing sections that are right next to each other. I'm kind of going away from the powder so that I can get some different areas down. And then I also notice if there's any areas that I missed, like I missed those two lines, I'll go back and get that powder down on those really quick. I just wanted to fill that in. And that's one thing I love about the pen, is that if you do miss an area, you can just go back and add some ink. You know, we're following along, and you can kind of see the wet ink, but I understand as our eyes get older and the light may not be as great, that you may miss a couple of lines. No worries. You can always go back with this pen and add them in. It's not going to cause you any trouble. Look at how we did that. So I added those couple of little lines, any place that I missed, and it filled in perfectly. So I'm going to continue doing this. I'll speed it up a little bit, but I'm going to get it all filled in, and then I'm going to show you what this looks like heat embossed. With the next card that we do, we're going to do this in a different way. We're not going to use the pen, and I'm going to show you the differences that creates, the different types of embossing powder and what effect that gives it, but also the different size of lines, and it just gives a completely different effect, both of which I love. But if you love embossing folders, you need to try both of them and see which one ends up being your absolute fave. Now, because I'm leaving mine, I haven't dried the powder. If I touch that powder with my pen, it is going to get on the tip of my pen. So if that happens to you, just wipe it on something. This is like an ink that can wipe off of other things. So I usually just run the pen along my mat and then use a little paper towel. I did feel like these were getting a little close, and where I'm putting my hand, I wanted to make sure that I don't knock the powder off because I tend to put my hand all over the project. So I decided I'd go ahead and heat the sections that I have currently, and then I'm going to continue this panel. So notice on this panel, I did pick a opaque color of embossing powder. Okay, so you're not going to see through it at all. It's a bright silver and it gives some light. The reason we did powder is to try to keep it from landing in between where we've used our ink, because we have an inky panel here. Sometimes can have a little bit of wetness on it, and so using that powder brush is super important. But if you mess up like I did and have a couple little strays, just grab a paintbrush that is not wet and brush it along. This just kind of, it's not like you're brushing the piece off. It's almost like you're getting the static away. So just touching the area, usually you can kind of blow that little piece off, or it'll get caught in your brush. Either way. Okay, and I want to show you the look this gives. I'm going to kind of move it around in the light so you can see, but you see it gives you kind of thicker silver lines with that beautiful shadow effect. Look at how beautiful that silver is. This is my favorite color, silver. I'm not going to show you the putting the card together, but I am going to show you the final card just so you can see the kind of effect that we just did. So beautiful web, just put a few spiders and a really cool sentiment on there, and it makes this card glow. So the next one, we're going to try an embossing powder that's not quite as opaque. And we're going to use a different embossing folder so that you can get the look. So the Simon Says Stamp embossing folder that we just did had a little bit thicker lines than this one. This one has some more fine lines, and you can see the middle of the web is at a different area. So I did an ink blended panel in purple, and I kind of tried to keep the center. I'm going to try to almost make the center of that web the center of the card. Okay, so you can line your panel up how you want it. Where I have the most light, I'm going to try to line that up. Now, one thing that I love about embossing folders is that I can kind of play with my layout. You know, they're bigger than an A2 size card, and you can really think about how you want this to be seen on the front of your card. So sometimes I'll even grab my sentiment and hold it over to see the parts of this web will be showing off. I really want to show off the ink blending and this embossing. So I'm grabbing, I know I'm going to use this sentiment, and I'm moving it around and placing my web where I think this looks the best. So just remember, you can decide where you want that. I'm also feeling the ridges because I want to make sure that I get this correct. In this one, I'm actually going to press the ridges down into the paper like I did with the last one, and we're going to try to ink up the embossing folder. Before we do that, we need to get some powder on this panel. And I'm using the Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool for this one. Sometimes I just grab different things. This embossing folder is from Honeybee Stamps. If you didn't know, I'm on the design team there as well. And so this is a very intricate with smaller lines than our previous one. So we're going to get it lined up, send it through with embossing ink on it. So let me grab the embossing ink. Now, when you're doing this technique, you do need to be careful with the pressure that you use. Sometimes I just kind of rub it along to catch the ridges that are raised up. You don't want to be pressing it down hard. If you're tapping, you're just barely tapping, because you're going to press ink onto the actual panel, and you'll get that on your card. So just gentle taps, or rub it. I feel like it's kind of like putting ink on a better press plate if you've ever used one of those, where kind of that circular motion will get you plenty of ink. Now, once I close this, I cannot move it because I've got an inked up area. So once you close it, hold it and do not let the panel move, or you'll get that ink on parts that you don't want it to be on. So be very gentle, very careful once you close your plate. Now, I did a lot of ink just to be safe. I didn't want to miss any spots because it's a little hard to do this a second time, whereas with the pen, you've got all the options to go back. This one's pretty much a once and done. And so once I've sent it through, let me show you what it looks like, and then we are going to add a more, I guess, see-through powder, but it's a black with glitter. So here's the panel. It has that ink down in it, and then we're going to use black glint, which has a lot of silvery texture to it and some black, but it isn't quite as bright as the other panel. And I kind of like that so much on this purple because it's just like just a hint of a web, and you can see it. You can see that that powder is sticking to parts of the panel, which is going to require some cleanup. Anytime you're using a glitter, even though I did put the powder down, I've still got some hanging on. And so that's why I said in the first part of the video that this, even though it seems like it should be faster, I have noticed with cleanup takes just as long as using the ink pen on these panels. And embossing powders with glitter like this are a little different than using your opaque. It's got more particles that just kind of want to stick, and so definitely one of those things. I also am going to eventually test these powder tools and see if there is a difference. So we did use two different powder tools, and we've got a lot more on this one. So I'm using that brush. You don't have to get this embossing powder off. If you just wanted your web and the background to have some kind of glittery fun effect to it, you could do that. I'm a little too OCD for that. For this one, is not my plan, and so I am going to clean it up with my brush. When you've got this glittery stuff on your brush, you may have to wipe your brush off just a little bit to make sure you keep breaking up that static. Remember, it's breaking up static, so I know you can't see me doing it, but as I get it kind of loose, I tend to blow on this card to get the areas there. And I'm not going to clean up every little particle, just where it's really thick on the main cardstock, because I want you to be able to see that purple back through the back of this web. So once I get that cleaned up, it's time to heat it. It is harder sometimes with glittery things like this to tell if you've heated them up like you're supposed to, but they do change color ever so slightly. So just watch, you will see, and I know it's hard to see in the camera, but it does ever so slightly change color. You can also always just test it with a little brush and just make sure that it's staying on the page. I'm now using a Swiffer mop piece to, or Swiffer duster piece, just to kind of dust off any extra that's there. And you can tell that it's definitely heated up because it's not coming off. Now, I forgot to add some water splatters to the back of this panel before I sent it through, so I did crack the panel a little bit, and I can see just a smidge of white through. So what I'm doing is, now that this embossing powder has been heated up, I'm adding a little bit of purple over any of those white cracks that we had. Just know that you can do that now, that this, even though it's glittery, it is stuck to that back panel. So you can do a little bit of fixing mistakes if you need to. So I went around in places where it was cracked, I added a little bit of my purple ink to it. Because the background is the focal point of this card, really all I did was add a couple of ghosts and the sentiment. I did a sparkly black sentiment with a little bit of white behind it, and that's really all it needed. Super easy. So I hope that you have enjoyed these two ways. I'm going to show you the final cards, but these two ways where you can either press the ink into your panel, or you can do the pen and just draw the impression that is made by that embossing folder. Two great ways to use it. So we also looked at two different types of embossing powder. This one is the one that's called Black Glint, and it's basically a black with some silvery to it. And then this one is a more opaque silver. So this one we use the pen on. You can tell the difference in the lines. Part of that is related to the embossing folder. This one has a little thicker lines, but you can get different effects with those. So I want you to try them in different ways. Tell me which was your favorite card. All of the information will be in the description for you to find the product. products. Have a great day. Bye.